Professor Vel'nath was having the best lecture of his career. 312 students packed the Xenobiology amphitheater, representing 49 different species, all listening to his masterful breakdown of galactic evolutionary patterns. The holographic projector hummed overhead, displaying pristine genetic models and biomechanical analyses. "Today, class, we examine nature's most spectacular failure," he announced, four eyes scanning the tiered seats with professional smugness. "A species so fundamentally flawed that their continued existence defies every principle of natural selection." Excited murmurs rippled through the audience. A few Krillilian students adjusted their recording devices. Someone in the middle rows shifted forward with anticipation. In seat number 203, a small bipedal figure wearing the standard university robes remained motionless. Species designation: Homo sapiens. Classification: evolutionary dead end. Status: recently contacted, diplomatically irrelevant. Vel'nath gestured dramatically as the hologram shifted to display a rotating anatomical model. "Behold, students! What happens when a planet produces intelligence without wisdom?" The floating human figure glowed red at specific points. Vel'nath pointed his primary manipulator appendage at the skeletal structure. "Notice the absurd design choices. Bipedal stance on unstable joints. Single heart circulatory systems. Calcium-based bone matrix that fractures under minimal stress. They are, quite literally, held together by biological duct tape." Scattered laughter echoed through the amphitheater. A Quellan student raised three of her arms. "Professor, how did such a flawed species achieve space travel?" "Excellent question." Vel'nath's secondary eyes gleamed. "Humans stumbled into technology through pure accident. Random mutations occasionally produce individuals capable of basic tool use. These anomalies briefly advance their civilization before the species reverts to its natural state of self-destruction." More students perked up. Datapads glowed as notes were frantically transcribed. The figure in seat 2003 pulled out a simple notebook and began writing, with what appeared to be a primitive, chemical-based marking implement. "Their planet's history reads like a cautionary tale," Vel'nath continued, warming to his theme. 14 major extinction events, 7 ice ages, volcanic catastrophes that should have eliminated all complex life, yet somehow, impossibly, humans survived each apocalypse and immediately began creating new ways to destroy themselves. The hologram shifted to display Earth's geological timeline. Red markers indicated mass extinction events. The professor's voice took on the tone of someone explaining a particularly amusing joke. "They invented nuclear weapons within decades of discovering atomic theory. Chemical warfare, biological agents designed specifically to target their own species. Most remarkably, they created these tools not for defense against external threats, but to use against other humans." A collective intake of breath swept the audience. Several students looked genuinely disturbed. The note-taker in the back row continued writing with steady, methodical strokes. "The social structures defy all logic," Vel'nath pressed on. "Pack animals that refuse to cooperate. Territorial instincts so strong they wage war over imaginary boundary lines. They possess the cognitive capacity for interstellar travel, yet they waste centuries fighting over which invisible sky embassy deserves the most worship." The Krillilian student raised a crystalline appendage. "Professor, if they're so dysfunctional, how did they achieve galactic contact?" Vel'nath's laugh was professionally condescending. "Pure luck, student Crixtal. Their first faster-than-light experiment was actually an attempt to create a weapons delivery system. They accidentally tore a hole in space-time while trying to destroy their political enemies." More laughter rippled through the crowd. The professor basked in the attention, his ego swelling with each appreciative chuckle. He failed to notice that one student had stopped laughing. The note-taker's pen had paused mid-sentence. "The Galactic Council voted to make contact purely out of morbid curiosity," Vel'nath explained. "We wanted to observe their extinction process firsthand. Current projections suggest they'll eliminate themselves within the next 50 solar cycles. Standard practice is to maintain minimal interaction and simply wait." A Zephyrian student's tentacles waved with excitement. "What makes them so self-destructive, Professor?" "Brain chemistry, dear Sixandra. Humans produce neurotransmitters that reward risk-taking behavior. They literally get biochemical pleasure from doing dangerous, illogical things. From their perspective, jumping off cliffs, ingesting toxic substances, and picking fights with larger predators feels good. The professor manipulated the hologram to show human neural pathways highlighted in pulsing yellow. They call this sensation adrenaline rush, or living on the edge. We call it evolutionary suicide programming. The note-taker finally looked up from their notebook. For the first time since the lecture began, Professor Vel'nath made eye contact with seat 203. The student was smaller than most species represented in the class. Pink-toned skin, bilateral symmetry, forward-facing optical organs. The professor's confidence faltered for exactly 3 seconds. The diplomatic protocols are equally baffling, he continued, determinedly ignoring the growing unease in his primary stomach. Humans negotiate by making threats they cannot possibly fulfill. They bluff with empty hands. They form alliances with species they've never met, then break those alliances over minor disagreements. The small student in the back row slowly raised one appendage. Vel'nath recognized the gesture as the universal symbol for requesting permission to speak. His throat suddenly felt remarkably dry. "Yes?" he managed. The voice that responded was clear, steady, and carried an accent that the professor's linguistic processors couldn't quite identify. "I have a clarifying question about your analysis, Prof." Every student in the amphitheater turned to look. The temperature seemed to drop several degrees. "Please proceed," Vel'nath said, though his instincts were screaming at him to end the lecture immediately. The small student stood up slowly. "You mentioned that humans form alliances with species they've never met. Could you elaborate on the methodology behind that assessment?" It was a perfectly reasonable academic question. Professional, polite, delivered in the kind of tone that professors heard every day. So why did Vel'nath suddenly feel like prey? "Well," he began, consulting his notes with hands that had developed a slight tremor. "Human diplomatic records show patterns of immediate trust establishment with species encountered for the first time. They offer assistance, resources, and military support based on limited interaction data." Interesting. The student made another note. "And you interpret this behavior as evidence of poor judgment?" "Obviously. No rational species would offer aid to strangers without extensive risk assessment protocols." "I see." More writing. "Would you say this represents a fundamental flaw in human cognitive processing?" Vel'nath nodded eagerly, grateful to return to familiar academic territory. "Precisely. Humans lack the basic survival instinct to distrust unknown entities. They operate under the delusion that universe is fundamentally benevolent." "Fascinating." The student closed their notebook with a soft snap. "Professor, I believe there may be some inaccuracies in your data." The amphitheater had gone completely silent. Even the air recycling systems seemed to hold their breath. "I'm sorry?" Vel'nath's voice came out higher than intended. The small student straightened to their full height, which was considerably less impressive than most species present. "Your analysis contains several factual errors. I'd be happy to provide corrections, and you are qualified to do so because..." The student smiled. It was not a particularly threatening expression by galactic standards. Most species smiled to indicate friendliness or submission. But something about the specific curvature of this smile made Vel'nath's primary nervous system spike with alarm. "My name is Jordan 579. I'm an exchange student from Earth. I've been auditing your Xenobiology course for the past 6 weeks." The professor's 4 eyes blinked in perfect synchronization. Several students gasped audibly. Someone dropped their datapad, which clattered against the floor with metallic echoes. "You're..." Vel'nath's voice failed him completely. "Human. Yes." Jordan's smile grew wider. "I've been taking notes on your lectures. Very thorough notes. I think my academic advisor back home will find them quite educational." Professor Vel'nath realized, with crystalline clarity, that his career had just taken a dramatic turn toward the catastrophic. "I don't suppose," Jordan continued conversationally, "I could request permission to give a brief counterpoint presentation next week? I have some alternative perspectives on human evolutionary biology that might interest the class." The amphitheater remained frozen in absolute silence. "Of course," Vel'nath whispered, because what else could he possibly say? Jordan gathered their primitive notebook and headed toward the exit. Every student tracked their movement with the focused attention usually reserved for avoiding large predators. At the doorway, Jordan paused and looked back. "Oh, Professor, you might want to review your data on human risk assessment protocols. I think you'll find it's more sophisticated than your current models suggest." The door closed with a soft hiss. 312 students stared at Professor Vel'nath in expectant silence. He had absolutely no idea what to say. Dean Mordak's office had never seen this level of panic. The administrative wing's climate control struggled to handle the collective stress sweat of 17 different species crammed into a space designed for formal meetings of 5. Emergency session protocols had been activated. The university's crisis management team occupied every available chair, perch, and hovering platform. "Let me understand this correctly," Mordak said, his voice carrying the careful control of someone trying not to scream. Professor Vel'nath spent an entire lecture explaining why humans are evolutionary failures. To a human who has been attending his class for 6 weeks. Technically, Administrative Assistant Kuhlbeard offered weakly. The student never identified their species during enrollment. Their name is Jordan 579. They listed Earth as their home planet. Their emergency contact is the Sol System Diplomatic Corps. Moradok's compound eyes bulged with stress. What part of this did our admissions department find ambiguous? The silence stretched until it became physically uncomfortable. "How long," Mordak continued, "has humanity been a member of the Galactic Council?" 83 standard days, whispered the head of Interspecies Relations. And our Xenobiology department decided this was the perfect time to publicly dissect their species as a cautionary tale about evolutionary failure. More silence. Someone's breathing apparatus whistled with anxiety. "Sir," Kelviran ventured, "perhaps we could convince the student to withdraw from the course? Offer them alternative credits?" Mordak's laugh held no humor whatsoever. "The human has requested permission to give a guest lecture. They want to provide what they called alternative perspectives on human evolutionary biology. Does anyone here want to guess what that means?" The crisis team exchanged glances that ranged from worried to terrified. "We could cancel the lecture," suggested the security chief. "Declare a facility emergency, and explain to the Galactic Council that we're so afraid of one human student that we shut down our university?" Mordak stood up, pacing to the window that overlooked the main campus. "No, we're going to let them give their presentation, and we're going to pray to whatever deities we worship that they're feeling merciful." "Sir, what if they're not?" asked the public relations director. Mordak stared out at the students moving between buildings, blissfully unaware that their institution was balanced on the edge of a diplomatic catastrophe. "Then we update our resumes." Jordan 579 had spent the week in an unusually good mood. Fellow students noticed them humming during meals. Their residence hall advisor mentioned seeing them in the common areas, chatting pleasantly with anyone who approached. The change was remarkable enough that several classmates commented on it. What none of them realized was that Jordan had submitted a requisition list to the university's maintenance department. The request had started simply enough. Standard presentation equipment, holographic projector, audio amplification, wireless connectivity. Then things got interesting. "They want access to the chemistry lab's molecular printer," reported maintenance supervisor Raxtol to his increasingly worried staff. "Specifically, they need to fabricate demonstration materials for their lecture." "What kind of demonstration materials?" asked his assistant. Raxtol consulted his datapad with visible reluctance. "Carbon-based explosive compounds, high-tensile metallic alloys, something called synthetic adrenaline, that required 3 different safety waivers." The maintenance crew looked at each other with growing alarm. "They also requested access to the athletic facility's gravity manipulation chambers," Raxtol continued, "and the medical center's bone density scanners. Oh, and they want to borrow 17 different types of toxins from the Xenobiology lab." "For a lecture?" "Apparently. They were very polite about it, said please and thank you, and explained that everything was for educational purposes only." The assistant's antennae twitched nervously. "Should we approve these requests?" Raxtol stared at the requisition form, particularly the section where Jordan had written, "Will return all borrowed materials in original condition unless consumed during demonstration. The dean's office says we're to provide full cooperation with the human's presentation needs. He signed the digital approval with a hand that shook slightly. May the ancestors preserve us all. By the third day, word about the upcoming lecture had spread beyond the Xenobiology department. Students whispered about it during meals. Faculty members discussed it in hushed tones between classes. The story grew with each retelling until half the campus believed that a human was going to challenge Professor Vel'nath to single combat. The university's communication system logged over 3,000 requests for lecture attendance. The original venue, designed for 300 students, would need to be changed. Emergency protocols were activated to reserve the Grand Amphitheater, typically used only for graduation ceremonies and major diplomatic events. Security reported unusual activity around campus. News crews from 7 different systems had somehow learned about the event. Diplomatic vehicles with unregistered transponder codes parked in visitor areas. Someone had spotted what appeared to be military observers, conducting discreet surveillance from the neighboring hills. "This is getting out of hand," Dean Mordak muttered, reviewing the latest attendance projections. "We're expecting over 5,000 audience members for our undergraduate presentation." "Sir, the Galactic News Network is requesting exclusive broadcast rights," his assistant informed him. "They're offering significant compensation." "Absolutely not. This is an academic institution, not an entertainment venue. They've already set up recording equipment outside the amphitheater." Mordak buried his face in his hands. How did a simple guest lecture become a galactic media event? Word is spreading through diplomatic channels that humans are finally going to set the record straight about their species, explained the communications director. Apparently, there's been significant discussion in council circles about Professor Vel'nath's research. What kind of discussion? The kind that involves military attachés asking pointed questions about human defensive capabilities? The dean felt his career prospects diminishing by the hour. Professor Vel'nath had spent the week in his office, frantically reviewing everything he'd ever written about human biology. His research suddenly seemed less comprehensive than he'd originally believed. The gaps in his data became more apparent with each review. His sources, he realized with growing horror, were primarily second-hand observations and theoretical projections. He'd never actually met a human before Jorn 579. "Professor," his research assistant poked their head through the doorway. "The human student is here to test the presentation equipment." Vel'nath looked up from his notes with the expression of someone awaiting execution. "Send them in." Jordan entered carrying a small bag and wearing the same pleasant smile that had haunted Vel'nath's dreams all week. "Good afternoon, Professor. I hope you don't mind me running through a quick technical check. I want to make sure everything works properly for tomorrow's presentation." "Of course," Vel'nath managed. "What exactly will you be presenting?" "Oh, just some basic corrections to your research methodology, a few updates on human evolutionary biology, some clarifications about our defensive capabilities." Jordan began connecting their equipment to the projection system with practiced efficiency. Nothing too complicated. The holographic display activated, showing what appeared to be a completely normal academic presentation template. Vel'nath felt a brief moment of relief. "I did want to thank you, Professor," Jordan continued conversationally. "Your lecture was incredibly helpful." "Helpful? It showed me exactly which misconceptions needed addressing. I've structured my presentation around your main points." Jordan's smile never wavered. "I think you'll find it very educational." The hologram flickered, briefly displaying an image that made Vel'nath's blood freeze in his veins. It was there for less than a second before returning to the standard template. But he'd seen enough. Explosive yield calculations, tactical deployment scenarios, something that looked suspiciously like a weapons manifest. "Is everything all right, Professor? You look pale." "Fine," Vel'nath whispered. "Everything's fine." "Excellent. I'll see you tomorrow then." Jordan gathered their equipment and headed for the door. "Oh, and Professor, you might want to sit in the front row. I think you'll want to take notes." The next morning, the Grand Amphitheater filled beyond capacity. Students, faculty, diplomatic observers, and media representatives packed every available space. The atmosphere buzzed with anticipation and barely contained anxiety. Jordan 579 walked onto the stage carrying nothing but a small remote control and the same pleasant smile they'd worn all week. The audience fell silent. "Good morning, everyone. Thank you for attending my presentation on alternative perspectives regarding human evolutionary biology." Jordan's voice carried clearly throughout the amphitheater without amplification. I thought we'd start with a brief correction to some recent academic misconceptions. The holographic display activated behind them, showing a simple title slide. Why Professor Vel'nath is spectacularly wrong about everything. A comprehensive analysis. Several people in the audience shifted uncomfortably. Professor Vel'nath, seated in the front row as suggested, felt his career officially ending. Before we begin, Jordan continued, still smiling, I want to assure everyone that this presentation has been approved by Earth's diplomatic corps and cleared through appropriate military channels. Everything you're about to learn is considered public information. The word military sent a ripple of unease through the crowd. Now then, Jordan clicked to the next slide. Let's talk about what Professor Vel'nath got wrong about human biology, starting with our adorable little cardiovascular systems. Dean Mordak, watching from the administrative booth, reached for his emergency communication device. This was not going to end well. The amphitheater's environmental system struggled to maintain optimal atmospheric conditions as 5,000 beings from 43 different species breathed, sweated, and secreted various stress pheromones. Emergency ventilation protocols had been activated twice already, and the presentation hadn't even begun in earnest. In the VIP section, diplomatic observers from the Galactic Council maintained carefully neutral expressions while frantically transmitting updates to their respective governments. Ambassador Keth Marin of the Andromedan Collective found himself genuinely curious about what revelations the human might provide. His species had always prided themselves on superior intelligence gathering, yet their files on humanity contained surprisingly little concrete data. Preliminary assessments suggest significant information gaps in current human documentation, he whispered into his encrypted communicator. Recommend elevated attention to proceedings. 3 rows behind him, military analyst Corvex of the Centauri Defense Corps was having similar thoughts, though considerably less diplomatic ones. Her preliminary security briefing on humans had been disturbingly vague. Phrases like insufficient data and requires further investigation appeared throughout official reports. For a species supposedly composed of evolutionary failures, humans seemed remarkably good at avoiding detailed scrutiny. The media section buzzed with barely contained excitement. Galactic News Network reporter Vixtel had covered diplomatic incidents across 16 systems, but nothing quite like this. Academic presentations typically generated viewership numbers in the hundreds. Current projections suggested over 50 million beings across the galaxy were tuning in for live coverage. This is unprecedented, she murmured to her camera operator. I've never seen this level of interest in a university guest lecture. Her colleague, a seasoned Rigelian journalist named Plexmar, nodded grimly. Something about this human has the entire diplomatic corps spooked. Look at the security presence. Indeed, the amphitheater's perimeter had been quietly reinforced with personnel from 7 different military organizations. Officially, they were present to censure proper crowd control protocols. Unofficially, everyone recognized preparation for potential emergency evacuation procedures. Meanwhile, in the students' section, word had spread about Professor Vel'nath's original lecture. Those who had missed it demanded detailed summaries from classmates. The retelling had grown more dramatic with each iteration, until some students believed Vel'nath had declared humans to be a galactic plague that should be eradicated immediately. Did he really say they were worse than the void parasites? Whispered a nervous Alterian sophomore. Worse, confirmed their study partner. He called them evolutionary suicide programming with opposable thumbs. Several students turned to stare at Jordan, who continued setting up presentation equipment with cheerful efficiency, apparently oblivious to the mounting tension. Professor Vel'nath sat in the front row as suggested, his 4 hands gripping his datapad with enough force to crack the casing. He'd spent the previous evening reviewing every piece of human research in the university's databases. The results had been deeply unsettling. Human military capabilities, classified. Human technological development, classified. Human diplomatic protocols, classified. Human population statistics, classified. Even basic information about human physiology carried security restrictions he'd never encountered before. How had he built an entire lecture series around a species whose actual data was locked behind military-grade encryption? Professor, his research assistant had asked the night before, why are human files classified at council-level security clearance? Vel'nath had no answer. Species files were typically public academic resources. The only exceptions involved active military threats or civilizations under diplomatic protection protocols. Neither category should apply to evolutionary failures. Behind him, Dean Mordick received a priority message on his emergency communicator. The text made his compound eyes widen with alarm. Human Diplomatic Corps. En route. ETA 15 minutes. Recommend postponing presentation pending official consultation. He looked down at Jordan, who was now testing microphone levels and appeared to be enjoying themselves immensely. Postponing seemed unlikely to succeed. Attention all faculty, Mordick transmitted on the administrative channel. Activate full recording protocols. Document everything. We may need detailed records for subsequent diplomatic review. In the technical booth, Chief Engineer Ralston monitored the humans' equipment connections with growing confusion. Jordan's presentation hardware included several components he didn't recognize. The power requirements seemed excessive for standard holographic displays. Most puzzling, their system appeared to be interfacing with the university's main database in ways that should have been impossible without administrative access codes. Are they supposed to be connected to our primary servers? His assistant asked nervously. Ralston consulted his authorization documents. According to the dean's office, we're to provide full technical cooperation, no restrictions, but they're accessing files marked faculty only and administrative review required. I know. Ralston watched data streams flowing between Jordan's equipment and the university's classified research archives. I really hope someone knows what they're doing. Down in the audience, Jordan finished their equipment check and turned to address the crowd. The amphitheater fell silent with almost supernatural speed. I want to thank everyone for such an impressive turnout, Jordan said, their voice carrying clearly through the acoustic systems. I understand many of you traveled significant distances to attend. I promise you won't be disappointed. They gestured toward the holographic display, which currently showed their deliberately provocative title slide. Professor Vel'nath's lecture raised some fascinating questions about human evolution, biology, and behavior. I thought it might be helpful to provide some corrections to his analysis. Jordan's smile grew slightly wider. After all, academic accuracy is important, don't you think? A few nervous chuckles echoed through the crowd. Professor Vel'nath slumped lower in his seat. Before we begin our discussion of human physiology, I should mention that Earth's Diplomatic Corps has provided me with some previously classified materials for today's presentation. Jordan clicked to the next slide, which displayed an official seal that made several military observers sit up straighter. Everything we'll cover today has been cleared for public release as part of humanity's new Transparency Initiative. The diplomatic section erupted in barely audible whispers. Ambassador Kethmorin felt his confidence evaporating. In his experience, governments only embraced transparency when they had something particularly impressive to reveal. Now then, Jordan continued cheerfully, let's start with Professor Vel'nath's assessment of human cardiovascular systems. He described them as monocardiac and prone to failure. I think you'll find the reality considerably more interesting. The holographic display shifted to show a three-dimensional model of human anatomy, far more detailed than anything in Professor Vel'nath's original presentation. This version pulsed with bioelectric activity and displayed real-time physiological data. Humans do indeed possess single-heart circulatory systems, Jordan explained. What Professor Vel'nath failed to mention is that human hearts are capable of functioning under gravitational forces that would crush most other species' multi-organ cardiac networks. The display zoomed in on the heart, showing muscle fiber density and pressure ratings that made several medical professionals in the audience lean forward with surprise. Dean Mordick, watching from above, received another priority message. Human diplomatic vessel has entered system space. They're not responding to standard arrival protocols. He looked down at Jordan, who was enthusiastically explaining human blood pressure capabilities, and wondered if his resignation letter should be formal or apologetic. Of course, cardiovascular efficiency is just one aspect of human physiology that Professor Vel'nath's research overlooked, Jordan continued, advancing to the next slide. Perhaps we should discuss the historical context that shaped human evolution. After all, understanding our development requires examining the environmental pressures we faced. The holographic display shifted to show Earth's timeline, marked with what appeared to be minor historical annotations. Jordan gestured casually at the floating dates. Humans experienced several small disagreements throughout our development period. Nothing too dramatic, but these events did influence our biological adaptations. Jordan's tone remained conversational, as if discussing weather patterns. For instance, there was a minor territorial dispute we called the 100 Years' War, lasted from 1337 to 1453, involving most of Europe. The hologram zoomed in on medieval battlefields. What had seemed like simple historical markers suddenly revealed themselves as detailed tactical displays showing siege warfare, cavalry charges, and casualty statistics that made several military observers reach for their recording devices. Then we had some economic disagreements in the early 20th century, 2 brief conflicts we called world wars. Jordan clicked forward, and the display showed global battlefronts spanning multiple continents. The first one involved 32 nations and resulted in roughly 40 million casualties. The second was slightly larger in scope. Ambassador Keth Morin felt his breathing apparatus constrict. The casualty numbers scrolling past the display exceeded the total populations of most civilized worlds. These weren't territorial disputes. They were extinction-level conflicts. During the second global disagreement, humans developed some interesting problem-solving techniques. Jordan explained with academic detachment. We created devices capable of releasing energy equivalent to 20,000 tons of conventional explosives. From a single weapon, we used 2 of them to end the conflict efficiently. The hologram showed mushroom clouds rising over cities. The radiation dispersal patterns and thermal damage assessments made several diplomatic observers quietly excuse themselves from the amphitheater. Professor Vel'nath mentioned that humans waste time fighting over imaginary boundaries, Jordan continued. I suppose that's technically accurate, although imaginary might understate the strategic importance we place on territorial control. For example, during our Cold War period, 2 human factions maintained enough nuclear weapons to destroy Earth's surface approximately 37 times over. Dean Mordak received an urgent message from the Galactic Council. Suspend presentation immediately. Human capabilities require immediate reassessment. He looked down at Jordan, who was cheerfully explaining intercontinental ballistic missile deployment strategies, and realized it was far too late for suspension. These minor disagreements taught us valuable lessons about biological optimization, Jordan said, transitioning smoothly to their next topic. Which brings us to Professor Vel'nath's assessment of human physiology. He described our bodies as held together by biological duct tape. I think that comparison deserves closer examination. The holographic display shifted to show human anatomy in unprecedented detail. This wasn't the basic educational model from medical textbooks. This was a real-time physiological analysis showing active biological processes. Human bone structure utilizes calcium phosphate matrices capable of withstanding impact forces up to 19,000 pounds per square inch before fracturing, Jordan explained. For comparison, that's roughly equivalent to the pressure generated by industrial hydraulic equipment. Several engineering students in the audience began taking frantic notes. The structural specifications being displayed exceeded most starship hull materials. Our muscle fiber density allows for rapid power generation under extreme stress conditions. During emergency situations, humans can lift objects weighing several times their body mass, run at speeds approaching 40 kilometers per hour, and maintain physical exertion for extended periods without rest. The display showed slow-motion footage of humans performing what Jordan called routine physical activities, climbing vertical cliff faces, swimming across vast bodies of water, running distances that would exhaust most species' cardiovascular systems. Professor Vel'nath was correct that humans possess single-heart circulatory systems, Jordan continued. What he failed to mention is that human hearts can function effectively at altitudes where atmospheric pressure drops to 1/3 normal levels. We regularly inhabit environments that would cause respiratory failure in most oxygen-dependent species. Medical professionals in the audience exchanged alarmed glances. The physiological tolerances being described approached mechanically augmented levels. Our nervous systems respond to damage by releasing chemical compounds that suppress pain sensation and enhance physical performance. Humans experiencing life-threatening injuries often continue fighting, working, or protecting others despite trauma that should cause immediate incapacitation. The hologram showed brain chemistry analyses that made several xenobiologists lean forward with fascination and growing horror. Human pain management systems weren't just efficient, they were designed for sustained combat effectiveness. Human immune systems are particularly interesting, Jordan added conversationally. We coexist with billions of microorganisms that would be lethal to most galactic species. Our bodies treat virulent bacteria, aggressive parasites, and toxic fungi as routine management challenges. A Rigelian medical student in the third row quietly stood up and headed for the exit. Several others followed, but Professor Vel'nath's most significant oversight involved human social behavior, Jordan continued, their enthusiasm growing noticeably. He described our pack bonding as illogical territorial instincts. I think you'll find human social structures considerably more complex. The atmosphere in the amphitheater had shifted from academic curiosity to barely contained unease. Jordan's presentation style remained cheerfully educational, but the content was systematically dismantling every assumption about human limitations. Humans form emotional attachments to virtually anything that responds to social interaction. We bond with other species, inanimate objects, abstract concepts, and occasionally with things that actively try to kill us. Jordan's smile grew wider. We call pets creatures that are genetically programmed to hunt, kill, and consume other animals. We keep them in our homes with our children. The holographic display showed images of humans interacting with what appeared to be various predatory species. Large carnivorous mammals, venomous reptiles, creatures with prominent fangs, claws, and aggressive behavioral patterns. Human pack bonding extends beyond individual relationships. We form collective attachments to groups, nations, ideological concepts, and sometimes to complete strangers based on shared experiences or perceived similarities. Jordan clicked to the next slide. When humans believe their pack is threatened, individual survival instincts become temporarily irrelevant. The display showed historical footage of humans running toward obvious danger to protect others, charging into burning buildings, attacking larger, better-armed opponents, deliberately placing themselves between threats and people they'd never met before. We have documented cases of humans fighting to protect individuals from completely different species, different planets, different evolutionary backgrounds. The logical basis for this behavior is... Jordan paused thoughtfully. Well, there isn't one. We just do it. Several more students quietly left their seats. The exodus was becoming noticeable. This brings us to human entertainment preferences, Jordan said, advancing to their final major topic. Professor Vel'nath suggested that humans possess poor survival instincts. I think our recreational activities might provide some insight into that assessment. The holographic display showed what appeared to be human leisure activities. The first few images looked innocent enough. Groups of humans gathered in social settings, consuming food and beverages, engaging in conversation. Humans create elaborate fictional scenarios designed to trigger fear, anxiety, and psychological distress. We call these horror movies, and we watch them voluntarily for enjoyment. Jordan's tone remained academically neutral. We pay to experience simulated terror in controlled environments. The display showed scenes from human horror films, creatures with excessive fangs and claws, supernatural entities that defied biological logic, scenarios involving human characters being stalked, threatened, and graphically eliminated by various monstrous antagonists. Horror entertainment serves several social functions. It allows humans to practice emotional responses to extreme threat scenarios. It provides safe environments for experiencing maximum stress levels. Most importantly, it helps us identify which situations we find genuinely disturbing. Ambassador Kethmoran realized with growing alarm that the human was essentially describing psychological warfare training disguised as recreational activity. We also enjoy competitive physical activities that would be classified as assault in most civilized legal systems, Jordan continued cheerfully. Boxing involves two humans attempting to render each other unconscious using repeated cranial impacts. Wrestling requires physically dominating opponents through leverage and superior strength application. The display showed humans engaged in various combat sports. The violence was carefully regulated and formally organized, but undeniably brutal by Galactic standards. Our extreme sports include deliberately falling from aircraft at high altitudes, descending vertical rock faces without safety equipment, and navigating hydraulic safety rapids in small watercraft with significant capsizing potential. Jordan gestured at footage of humans engaging in activities that looked suspiciously like elaborate suicide attempts. We consider these fun because they provide what we call adrenaline rushes, biochemical reward responses triggered by proximity to death or serious injury. Dean Mordak watched the amphitheater's population steadily decreasing as more audience members decided they had urgent business elsewhere. The remaining crowd sat in stunned silence, trying to process the implications of Jordan's presentation. Professor Vel'nath characterized humans as evolutionary failures destined for self-destruction, Jordan concluded. I hope today's presentation has provided some alternative perspectives on that assessment. The holographic display returned to Jordan's original title slide, Why Professor Vel'nath is Spectacularly Wrong About Everything, a comprehensive analysis. The silence in the amphitheater was absolute, not the comfortable quiet of an engaged audience, but the suffocating stillness that follows the detonation of something catastrophic. Even the environmental systems seemed to hold their breath. Professor Vel'nath sat frozen in the front row, his forehands gripping his datapad so tightly that stress fractures had appeared in the casing. His academic career was over. Not just damaged, but completely atomized. Everything he'd written about human evolution would need to be retracted. His textbooks would be recalled. His reputation within the xenobiology community was already spreading across academic networks as a cautionary tale about insufficient research methodology. Behind him, the remaining audience members processed what they'd witnessed with varying degrees of success. The Centauri military attaché was frantically transmitting encrypted updates to her command structure, specifically requesting immediate tactical assessments of human military capabilities. Her hands shook as she typed, and for good reason. If humans considered nuclear warfare a minor disagreement, what did they classify as a serious conflict? In the diplomatic section, Ambassador Kethmoran was having what his species would classify as an existential crisis. The Andromedan Collective prided itself on superior intelligence gathering and strategic analysis. Their first contact protocols were legendary for their thoroughness. Yet somehow, they'd completely misread an entire species. Humans weren't primitive newcomers stumbling into galactic civilization. They were apex predators who'd been politely waiting for everyone else to stop underestimating them. Emergency council session required, he whispered into his communicator. Human threat assessment protocols require immediate revision. Recommend elevation to priority alpha status. The student section had thinned considerably, but those who remained were taking notes with the desperate intensity of scholars trying to document a natural disaster. A Terrian anthropology major realized that her thesis on peaceful species integration would need substantial revisions. Several xenobiology students were already composing messages to their academic advisors, requesting course transfers to less potentially dangerous fields of study. In the media booth, Galactic News Network reporter Vixtel was experiencing the journalistic equivalent of winning a cosmic lottery. This wasn't just a story. This was the story that would define her career. 50 million beings across the galaxy were watching a single human systematically dismantle centuries of accepted scientific doctrine about their species. Are you getting all of this? She hissed to her camera operator. Every terrifying second, Plexmar confirmed, his recording equipment capturing Jordan's presentation for what would undoubtedly become the most watched academic lecture in galactic history. The technical staff monitoring from the booth had their own concerns. Chief Engineer Ralston watched data streams flowing between Jordan's equipment and the university's databases, realizing that the human had somehow accessed classified research files, from 17 different star systems. Their presentation wasn't just correcting Professor Vel'nath's research. It was revealing how extensively various governments had been monitoring and documenting human capabilities while publicly maintaining the fiction that humans were harmless newcomers. They're pulling data from Council military archives, his assistant reported nervously. Files marked species assessment, confidential, and tactical evaluation, restricted access. How is that possible? I don't know. Their authorization codes are legitimately issued, but they're accessing information that should require unanimous council approval. Dean Mordak received another priority message, this one from the Galactic Council's Emergency Response Division. Human diplomatic vessel has ignored standard approach protocols. They're requesting immediate landing clearance and refusing to explain mission parameters. He stared down at Jordan, who was organizing their presentation materials with the same cheerful efficiency they'd maintained throughout the lecture, and wondered if the university was about to become the site of humanity's first official diplomatic incident. The few remaining faculty members were grappling with the academic implications of what they'd witnessed. Human studies would need to be completely restructured. Safety protocols for human exchange students would require immediate review. Several professors were already questioning whether their own research might contain similarly catastrophic oversights about other species. Dr. Kexlara from the psychology department was frantically reviewing her files on human emotional development, suddenly realizing that what she'd classified as abnormal aggression markers might actually represent standard human behavioral patterns. If humans considered horror movies recreational entertainment, what did that suggest about their baseline comfort levels with violence and psychological stress? "Any questions?" Jordan asked again, their voice carrying across the amphitheater with the same pleasant tone they'd used throughout the presentation. The silence stretched until it became physically uncomfortable. Professor Vel'nath's breathing apparatus wheezed with the strain of processing increasingly toxic levels of stress hormones. His career wasn't just ending, it was being publicly executed in front of the largest academic audience in galactic history. But the silence had become unbearable, and professional pride demanded he ask the question that everyone was thinking. "Yes, sir," Colonel Vel'nath said, abruptly, reluctant to. He stood up slowly, his legs trembling with the effort. I have a question." Jordan turned toward him with that same pleasant smile. "Of course, Professor. Please proceed. In your presentation, you mentioned that humans form pack bonds with other species. You described military conflicts that eliminated millions of your own kind. You explained how humans create entertainment based on psychological terror." Vel'nath's voice cracked slightly. "My question is, what do humans do to species that actually threaten them?" The amphitheater somehow became even quieter. Several diplomatic observers leaned forward despite their obvious reluctance to hear the answer. Jordan's expression grew thoughtful, as if considering how to phrase something complex for an academic audience. "That's an excellent question, Professor. I think the best way to explain it would be through examples." The holographic display activated, showing what appeared to be a peaceful pastoral scene. Rolling hills, scattered vegetation, and several four-legged creatures grazing contentedly. "These are wolves," Jordan explained conversationally. "Approximately 40,000 years ago, they were apex predators that competed with humans for territory and resources. They hunted in coordinated packs, possessed superior strength and speed, and considered humans potential prey." The image shifted to show historical depictions of wolf-human conflicts, snarling predators surrounding small groups of humans, territorial disputes over hunting grounds, the clear dynamic of two species fighting for survival dominance. "Wolves were legitimately dangerous to early human communities," Jordan continued. "They threatened our food supplies, attacked our settlements, and killed our pack members. So humans developed a solution." The display transitioned to modern images that made several audience members inhale sharply. Wolves, but different. Smaller, varied in coloration and size, and unmistakably docile, sitting obediently beside human children. "We call them dogs now," Jordan said with casual pride. "Humans didn't eliminate wolves. We genetically modified them over thousands of generations until they became psychologically dependent on human approval. Today, there are over 800 million dogs on Earth. They compete for human attention, obey human commands, and exist primarily to provide companionship." Ambassador Kethmaran felt his respiratory system malfunction briefly. The implications were staggering. Humans hadn't defeated their competitors. They'd turned them into willing subordinates. We applied similar techniques to other threatening species, Jordan continued, advancing to the next slide. Aurochs were large, aggressive bovines that competed for grazing territory. We converted them into cattle. Wild boars threatened our agricultural settlements. We domesticated them into pigs. Predatory cats interfered with our food storage systems. We turned them into house cats that voluntarily controlled rodent populations. The holographic display showed the progression from wild, dangerous animals to their modern, domesticated equivalents. Each transformation represented a species that had gone from predator or competitor to willing servant. Professor Vel'nath asked what humans do to species that threaten us. Jordan said, their smile growing slightly wider. We don't destroy them. We reprogram them to love us. The absolute silence that followed was broken only by the sound of the Rigelian military observer, quietly excusing himself from the amphitheater. But that raises an interesting question, Jordan continued, apparently oblivious to the mounting horror in their audience. What happens when humans encounter species that can't be domesticated through conventional breeding programs? The holographic display shifted to show technical diagrams that made the remaining military personnel reach for their emergency communicators. Genetic modification protocols, behavioral conditioning frameworks, psychological manipulation techniques that bordered on biological warfare. Humans have developed remarkably sophisticated approaches to interspecies relationship management, Jordan explained with academic enthusiasm. We've learned to identify psychological vulnerabilities, exploit social bonding mechanisms, and implement behavioral modification programs that work across multiple biological frameworks. Dean Mordak received an urgent message from the Galactic Council. Emergency session authorized. All member species to implement immediate human diplomatic protocol review. Recommend extreme caution in future interactions. The beautiful thing about human pack bonding, Jordan continued, is that it works in both directions. Once humans decide you're part of their social group, they become psychologically incapable of abandoning you. We'll fight impossible odds, sacrifice individual survival, and dedicate entire civilizations to protecting beings we've accepted as pack members. The display showed historical examples of humans defending other species, extinction prevention programs, conservation efforts that required decades of sustained commitment, environmental protection initiatives that prioritized animal welfare over human economic interests. So when Professor Vel'nath asks what humans do to threatening species, the answer depends entirely on whether those species are willing to be friends, Jordan concluded cheerfully. We strongly prefer the friendship option. The presentation ended with Jordan's original title slide, but now the words carried entirely different implications. Professor Vel'nath sat down heavily, his datapad falling forgotten to the floor. 2 weeks later, the University of Advanced Xenobiological Studies had implemented the most comprehensive curriculum revision in its institutional history. The Department of Evolutionary Biology was restructured completely. Professor Vel'nath's textbooks were recalled from 17 star systems. Emergency sessions were held to retrain faculty members whose research had been deemed potentially catastrophically inaccurate. The university's new Human Studies program required approval from 3 different Galactic Council committees before implementation. Safety protocols were established. Diplomatic liaisons were assigned. The course catalog now included warnings that study of human biology, psychology, and social structures required special clearance and psychological preparation. Professor Vel'nath found himself reassigned to a newly created position, Director of Interspecies Diplomatic Relations. His first course, Advanced Human Communication Protocols, focused primarily on ensuring that future academic exchanges avoided accidentally insulting species capable of converting their enemies into willing pets. Today we'll discuss the importance of cultural sensitivity when interacting with apex predator civilizations, Vel'nath announced to his new class. A small group of carefully selected graduate students who'd undergone psychological screening for emotional stability. Can anyone explain why direct criticism of human evolutionary development might be considered inadvisable? A nervous Alterian student raised her hand. Because they might decide we need behavioral modification therapy? Exactly, Vel'nath confirmed. consulting his carefully prepared notes. Remember, humans consider friendship a bi-directional social contract. They expect the same loyalty from their allies that they provide to their pack members. Failure to reciprocate appropriate social bonding can result in reclassification. The students took careful notes, particularly the section about avoiding phrases like evolutionary failure, genetic dead end, or destined for extinction. Meanwhile, Jordan 579 had become something of a campus celebrity. Their presentation had been downloaded over 2 billion times across galactic networks. Academic journals competed to publish their follow-up papers. Several governments had quietly submitted requests for cultural exchange programs. More importantly, Jordan had never eaten alone in the cafeteria again. Students from dozens of different species sought them out for conversation. Faculty members invited them to guest lecture in various courses. The university's social dynamics had shifted around, ensuring that their human exchange student felt welcomed, appreciated, and definitely not threatened. One day, "How are you adjusting to your newfound campus popularity?" Dean Mordick asked during their monthly advisory meeting. Jordan smiled with genuine warmth. "It's wonderful. Everyone's been so friendly since my presentation. I think Professor Vel'nath's lecture really helped people understand the importance of accurate information." "Indeed," Mordick agreed carefully. "And your academic progress?" "Excellent. I'm considering extending my exchange program for another semester. There's so much more I could teach about human cultural practices." Jordan's eyes lit up with enthusiasm. "Did you know humans have an entire holiday dedicated to dressing up as frightening creatures and visiting strangers' homes to demand food offerings?" Dean Mordick made a note to schedule another emergency faculty meeting. Outside the administrative building, students from various species gathered in the quad, chatting peacefully in the afternoon sunlight. Humans, it turned out, were excellent friends, once you understood the rules. The key was making sure they never felt threatened or excluded from the social group. After all, nobody wanted to find out what humanity's advanced domestication protocols looked like when applied to spacefaring civilizations. The campus had never been more harmonious.